right, so let's do exactly the same thing for aggregate supply, and I'll just move my face out of the way here. So first and foremost, let me get myself over here. No, it doesn't want me to do that. Okay, so first and foremost, remember we draw the aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve, and that tells us everything we need to know about our three macroeconomic goals. So inflation, real GDP, and full employment. And the great thing about aggregate supply is anything that shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right means that in the long term, all three goals are achieved. So you don't really have to even think about whether or not the goals are going to be achieved. And if we have that very terrible situation where the aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, it's the opposite. Now just remember that usually aggregate supply curve doesn't shift to the left. So what could be our question? What's the structure of our question? It's going to be exactly the same as we just did before for aggregate demand, but now it's for aggregate supply. So explain how insert an aggregate supply factor would impact the achievement of any goal, any of our three goals. Remember, our aggregate supply factors are the quality and quantity of the factors of production, our productivity, cost of production, technological improvements, and the exchange rate or climate. So how would a change in any one of these aggregate supply factors affect aggregate supply and therefore our macroeconomics goals? So the structure is very simple, but unfortunately we don't have a formula like we do in aggregate demand, but we do have a very similar and simple structure for answering aggregate supply curve questions, aggregate supply questions. So we start off with our factor, same as we did with aggregate demand. Then we need to refer to aggregate supply, productive capacity, and a really important phrase here, the ability and willingness to produce. Does that increase or decrease? So this second mark here is almost like your formula for aggregate demand. And again, it's really simple because if aggregate supply increases, so does productive capacity, and so does the ability and willingness to produce, and vice versa. The third mark is to link to our long-term capacity and the potential growth rate. And finally, to bring back to the goal. Let's have a go. So explain how an increase in labour market productivity, so that's one of our aggregate supply factors, would impact the achievement of the government's goal of strong and sustainable growth. We could do any goal. So we start out with a factor, an increase in labour market productivity. Again, I've got a little definition in brackets like I did in aggregate demand. Doesn't disrupt the flow of your writing. Will mean a decrease in the cost of productions per unit, cost per unit for firms. Basically, it means, workers, not works. I'll fix that after. Workers can produce more on average. So the cost per unit goes down. This improves aggregate supply. Obviously, it shifts the aggregate supply to the right. And we're going to say it increases the ability and willingness of firms to produce at each and every price, which is the same as saying it's an increase in AS, just a better way of doing it. This will also increase the productive capacity, like we said. So we've done our three, AS, ability and willingness, and productive capacity, and they all move in the same direction. From there, we're going to say this increases the long-term potential growth rate, because really aggregate supply shifting is a long-term thing, and it improves the potential growth rate. So, depending on the goal that we're thinking about or the goal that we're going to answer, we would then say for strong and sustainable growth, we can produce more, we can create jobs without inflation. We need to produce enough to create jobs, but no inflation. For full employment, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to say it increases our international competitiveness, and it basically means that there's an expansion along the aggregate demand curve as the supply curve shifts to the right. If we go back here, so we're going to say this movement here is going to be an increase in exports being sold overseas. Price stability puts downward pressure on prices and allows us to grow allows AD to grow without inflationary pressures emerging. So a little bit different for each one there. So you got to think, what goal am I trying to get to? We're doing strong and sustainable growth. And finally, we bring it all back to the goal. So in this case, it means the goal of strong and sustainable growth is more likely to be achieved. Remember, if the aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, you're always going to be more likely to achieve your goal in the long term. I've said that the target is 3 to 3.5% increase in real GDP. And I've also mentioned that the strong component will be achieved as more jobs can be created without inflation, which is a sustainable component. So again, if I go back to the four marks, 1 for a factor, 2 for those 3, aggregate supply, productive capacity, and ability and willingness. 3 is sort of the link between the long-term capacity or the potential growth rate and your goal. And 4 is going to be